The wind moves first, an invisible hand over the serrated backs of sandstone, then the soft scrape of chaparral on stone. Down in the wash, coyotes have run their night paths thin as rawhide. Above, the fins lean like stalled waves toward the hot sky. Long after the man is gone, these rocks keep his name. Long before that, they kept his secrets. But we are not yet among the rocks. We are in Monterey, 1835, a port clutched by fog and memory. In a town of adobe walls and bell towers, a boy is born into a respected Californio family. A boy who will later tell the world that his birthday is August 11th, feast day of St. Tiburtius, though some records say April 11th. The ambiguity feels apt. From the start, Tiburcio Vásquez lives at the meeting of two truths, two calendars, two countries debating who he is and what he owes them. In those days, California is Mexican, and the ranchos are kingdoms of grass. On the coast and in the valleys, families with deep roots measure wealth not in coin, but in cattle, in leagues of range, in family honor, and the skill of riding straight into weather. The boy learns letters, learns to read both Spanish and the shifting faces of men, learns the guitar and the dance step, the courtesy of a bow on a polished sala floor. Handsome and quick, he will always be welcomed where candles and music make the walls glow. He will also learn a sharper lesson, that a smile can disarm a man faster than a six-gun and last longer. Then the world tilts. In 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo hands California to the United States with promises inked across the treaty, promises that every Californio title will be respected. Within a few years, the California Land Act of 1851 flips those promises on their head. The burden of proof shifts to the original landholders, who must suddenly defend their titles in a new language, before new judges, paying new lawyers they can scarcely afford. Cases drag on, claims bleed out in fees and taxes, and a people anchored by land feel the anchor snap. Even where land remains, the air grows harsher. The gold rush pulls a tide of newcomers over the Sierras, and the state taxes foreign miners, especially Mexicans and Chinese, until many sell their tools, their hopes, and leave the diggings bitter. Resentment settles like dust in the mining camps. Violence visits without knocking. A boy becoming a young man cannot help but lean toward the idea that dignity must be defended with both words and steel. Nature joins the assault. The winter of 1861-62 drowns pastures. The drought that crowns it kills cattle by the thousands. For many Californio rancheros, the ledger flips from black to red. Debt is a slow fire that burns the same as any other. In the cantinas and on the veranda steps, men talk of what was promised and what was taken. Some hire new lawyers, some pray. Some, like Vasquez, will choose motion, fast, decisive, and dangerous. But Tiburcio's path bends earlier than the floods or droughts, and for reasons more immediate than politics. It begins, some say, in a room pulsing with music. Fandango night in Monterey, September 1854. Two men quarrel, the quarrel flares, a constable steps in, and the night hardens. By dawn, the constable, named in some sources as William Hardmount, is dead, and young Vasquez runs with men who believe that the law will not pause to sort his innocence from his proximity. Whether he fired the fatal shot or only stood too close to a friend's fury, he learns how fast a life can turn on a single breath. The lesson will follow him to the end. Running becomes habit. There are small robberies, some clumsy, some agile. There is bravado in the easy charm that opens doors. He is caught, and again he slips. Then in 1857, the iron gates of San Quentin receive him, and their slam is the sound of something permanent. 5 years, says the sentence. 5 years to study the machinery of punishment from the inside, to learn how men bend under rules and how they break them. In those gray corridors, he will see escapes cut short by bullets, witness the terrible arithmetic of risk and reward. The boy who grew up in lighted rooms learns the geometry of narrow cells and the chemistry of fear. When he leaves, he is not the same. Perhaps he has never been the same for long. He comes out leaner, more deliberate, a blade ground on the stone of confinement. He has gathered skills that do not appear on schoolhouse lists: how to read a posse's patience, how to map a ridge by the way the wind lies down on it, how to borrow a man's loyalty for a night and disappear before morning, how to tie a captive's wrist so the knot holds but the blood still runs. A strange chivalry grows alongside the outlawry. He will boast later that he never killed, that if men died in his raids, it was not by his hand. It is a claim that will stalk him through interviews, through trial, onto the gallows. Even now, when he squares his shoulders and answers a question with a singer's courtesy, you can see the man he wishes to be. You can also see the man the papers are beginning to write. In the plazas and kitchens of the California world, the talk around him is mixed. Some see a thief bringing more trouble to a proud people already squeezed by taxes, litigation, and the disdain of newcomers. Others, especially young men, nursing grievances and old men nursing memory. Here in Vasquez, a promise that someone still rides for their side. The very debate feeds him. He is at once a warning and a wish. He moves north and south like a needle in a frantic compass. The 1860s thicken with entries in sheriff's ledgers, burglaries in Sonoma country towns, cattle lifted in the night along the oak-scattered hills, stage dust kicked up on lonely grades before the driver spots the guns. The papers give him an outline of myth. The wanted notices try to pin it down with measurements, height, eyes, scars, like lacing rawhide around smoke. In the spaces between facts, his own legend blooms. A literate bandito who plays guitar and dances. A courtly robber who ties hands and leaves men face down, but alive. A rider who knows every arroyo and draw as if he had walked them in another life. Some of it is true. Some of it is useful. All of it is dangerous. If he looks over his shoulder, and he always looks, he can still see Monterey in the distance, the fandango lights, his mother's voice, the saints' days and the schoolmaster's chalk, the day when California changed hands and the legal ground shifted under every old house. He is the product of an argument between eras. The six-gun on his hip argues one way. The poems he copies for admirers argue another. He keeps both arguments alive by staying alive. Ahead, the valleys open into 1,000 miles of possibility. Somewhere beyond the next ridge is a store with a brass-bound register, a stage box with a chain, a ranchero with a pistol and a grudge, a sheriff counting miles and money, a newspaper man eager for a column inch of outrage. Somewhere beyond the next ridge, too, is a town called Pinos, and a night that will stamp his name in letters so large even the rocks will take it. But before the hard nights, there is twilight, and he spends it where a man like him is always welcome. A courtyard, a guitar, the murmur of Spanish under the sycamores. A woman who wants to hear about far places. He tells her about horses and stars because they are both true and safe. He does not tell her that he woke that morning to the scrape of a pasa's dream along his spine. He does not tell her that he can walk into any canyon in California and find a way out. He has learned to keep some truths like coins hidden in the lining of a jacket. He has learned to keep moving. The wind rises again across the chaparral, and if you listen closely, you can hear the long, low note of something beginning. Not a song exactly, and not yet a chase. It is the sound a life makes when it gathers itself for the run. Tomorrow there will be plans to lay, rifles to clean, men to choose and dismiss with a raised eyebrow. Tomorrow there will be maps that are not on paper, just remembered ridgelines and the taste of alkali in a particular draw. Tomorrow his name will ride telegraph wires. Tonight there is the quiet of a country not yet decided about him or about itself. The country will decide soon, so will he. San Quentin had a way of polishing a man to a hard edge, and then throwing him back against the world to see what snapped first. When Tiburcio Vásquez first heard the iron hush of its gates in 1856, he was 21, caught horse rustling near Newhall, and sentenced to 5 years. Inside, he watched the arithmetic of desperation add up to blood. Prison lore claims he helped organize 4 break attempts that left scores wounded and some 24 convicts dead. Whether he led or simply survived, the lesson was the same. Plans are measured in inches and seconds, and fear must be tamed like a bronc, or it throws you. When he stepped out again, the air tasted different, freer, but edged like a knife. Freedom didn't loosen its hold for long. By 1866, he was back in the northern counties, moving along river towns where a man could disappear between a livery and a saloon. A burglary in Petaluma ended badly. He was seized, hauled before a magistrate, and sent away for 3 more years. The papers used words like desperado and notorious, fixing his face to a stencil that would follow him down every road. A jailer's ledger can be a peculiar school. It taught Tiburcio patience and economy. Never show all you know, never spend the last hour of darkness before dawn. When he walked free in 1870, he did not swagger. He arranged himself as carefully as a deck of cards. He found in those first weeks that the state had changed tempo. Telegraph clicks now ran ahead of riders. Wells Fargo strongboxes traveled under watchful eyes. Sheriffs wore mileage on their boots like badges. If a man meant to live outside the law, he needed three things: companions who could keep silence, a web of sympathies stretched across kitchens and corrals, and a way of working that made his name heavy with warning. Vasquez began to build all three. The companions came first. Some were old acquaintances who respected his easy authority and his sense of theater. He understood how a gesture, an untied scarf, a courteous greeting in Spanish before a holdup, could unsettle men who expected only snarls. Others were hunters by necessity, drawn by the promise of quick money and quicker horses. In 1870, the loose circle hardened into a band with names that would echo in reward posters: Juan Soto at the outset, and later Procopio Bustamante, a knife-quick rider whose uncle had ridden with Joaquin Murrieta. The company shifted like sand, but a core remained. Men who could move at night, count hoofbeats on hardpan, and vanish into the next fold of the hills before a posse could saddle. Vasquez imposed a code. He had learned to keep blood off the floor when coin would due. Victims were to be tied, their hands crossed behind them, and left face down until the dust settled and the hoofbeats thinned. The method became his signature, as recognizable as his trimmed goatee and the careful politeness he showed to farmers' wives. It wasn't kindness so much as strategy. A living witness could be an alibi if he saw the man's restraint. And the same witness could carry stories into kitchens and taverns that swelled a different legend of Tiburcio, the honorable bandit, the defensor who robbed but did not slaughter. He would repeat it himself later when a reporter pressed him: "I have never killed." Fact or pose, the line was part of the performance, and he understood performance as well as any actor ever would. Even an artful life meets the ugly surprise of lead. Not long after his 1870 release in Santa Cruz, he collided with law in the person of Officer Robert Liddell. Shots traded in a blur, Vasquez hit hard, badly, staggering into backyards and alley shadows with the doggedness of a man who refuses to leave his bones on a street. He escaped the net and was carried, some say by friends, some say by family, into a safe room where his sisters nursed him day and night until fever broke and breath steadied. He learned then how thin the membrane is between life and story. A few inches of muzzle, a few hours of care, and a man the papers had already half buried stood up again and reached for his boots. Pain made him more careful. He changed horses often, read terrain the way a gambler reads faces, and practiced the difficult craft of being seen only as much as you choose to be seen. He courted allies in kitchens where a bowl of caldo and a wink could buy a night's shelter, in barns where a cousin of a cousin kept a blanket in the loft, in courtyards where a guitar and a sweet song could reassure the worried and recruit the willing. He recruited, too, from men with long hurts and short prospects. In 1871, a lean rider named Abdun Leyva joined up, useful enough with a pistol and a promise, and, like many, carrying more past than future. The bandito's economy depended on just such men. Binding together the resentments of a shifting state into a mobile enterprise, you could fold up and hide in a saddlebag. Work resumed. The pattern the newspapers scrawled in ink grew familiar. A store at the edge of town, the quick entrance at dusk when lamplight makes silhouettes, a stage halted on a lonely grade while the driver squints through dust to make out raised hands. Cattle drifting off a night range like a small brown river. The hoof prints brushed out with a willow branch as the moon sets. In the ledgers of Sonoma and Mendocino counties, of creek towns and valley stations, the counts grow. Purses, watches, knives, the odd silver dollar hammered thin from use. Some jobs are sloppy, some are satin smooth. Either way, by morning, the posse is speaking his name with the flat vowels of anger. Around adobe hearths and under pepper trees, others murmur it differently, the syllables warmer, their eyes full of stories where justice wears a different coat. He didn't live off glory, he lived off information, a stage schedule that hasn't changed in months. A ranchero who boasts too loudly of a cash roll in his desk. A lawman whose envy of a rival blurs his aim. Vasquez understood that California was not one country, but many, layered like the rock in the ranges. Anglo and Californio, farmer and miner, sheriff and vigilante, Chinese cook and Irish teamster, each with their own maps and timetables and grudges. He could move along the seams. He could be the courteous guest with polished Spanish in a Monterey plaza on Sunday, and the shadow that melted into an arroyo south of San Luis Obispo on Tuesday before sunrise. He also understood theater as shield and sword. After the Santa Cruz wound, when he could ride at length again, he sometimes presented himself in a town square, dressed almost like a gentleman, boots brushed, hat set at an angle that said confidence rather than menace. He paid in cash quickly and stepped away before any man decided to test his luck. The message was simple. I am not afraid to be among you. You could hate such a message. You could admire it, but you could not easily ignore it. Among his own men, he reigned by a cool mixture of praise and frost. A competent job earned a nod and a better horse. Foolishness earned a silence so heavy that a man might wish he'd been struck. He discouraged drinking before a job and singing after one. He told them, half jest, half liturgy, that a clean knot and a clean getaway are the difference between a rider and a ghost. He kept stories alive around the fire, but not plans. Those he moved from head to head like a hidden coin. And always he kept two truths polished: that he was a wrong Californio in a state where title papers and judges' smiles had stripped old families of their place, and that he was a working outlaw whose work would go on until a bullet, a rope, or a miracle stopped it. By the summer of 1873, he had grown into the kind of shadow that casts itself forward. Telegraphers heard his name before the first hoof struck the next road. Children dared each other to say Vasquez after dark. Posses chased rumors and dust. He steered his men toward the coast range, toward a small settlement where the hills fold in on themselves, and a country store sits like a fat purse in the open palm of a valley. The place is called Tres Pinos, and he studies it the way a hunter studies a deer at water. Distance, wind, the habits of the thirsty. They ride in the dark, sleeping by day in a fold above a spring, the horses ground-tied among the buckbrush. He orders the men to clean their firearms and to keep their voices low. Even laughter carries over a dry basin like a shouted warning. Below them, a store glows at dusk, and a hotel's piano picks out a tune for a handful of travelers and locals who think the night is theirs. If fate were a thing a man could see, Tiburcio might have watched it pool there, silver as mercury, before spilling down the road toward his camp. He draws a plan in the dust with a stick. Swift entry, swift binding, horses ready on the far side like a promise. He reminds them, as he always does, that a man's life is not to be wasted for a loose coin. He can be generous and ruthless in the same sentence. Then he smooths the dust with his palm and stands. The band gathers their hats and their nerve. Far away, a telegraph wire hums in the night like a taut string tuned to the note of tomorrow. Up here, only the crickets count them down. Before midnight, they are in the saddle, shadow moving over shadow, and the road unspools toward Tres Pinos like a fuse. They came in quiet as cloud shadow, 5 shapes dissolving and forming again where the road slid through oaks and yellow grass. The town, hardly a town at all, more a crossroad with a pulse, dozed under a late summer moon. Lamps burned in Snyder's store, throwing a bright rectangle out onto the dust. Across the lane, the hotel's piano picked out a tune that sounded braver than the player felt. The hour was ripe for men who preferred their luck with witnesses drowsy and the cashier's till fattened by travelers too tired to haggle. Vasquez signaled with 2 fingers, and the band fanned like a dealer's hand. Doors opened with the confidence of men who had rehearsed the moment a dozen times in their heads. Inside the store, the night shrank to the width of the counter, the smell of lamp oil and leather, and the hard blink of surprise on faces that had assumed, a heartbeat before, that the world was a simple thing. Gunmetal glinted. The script began. Hands up, faces down, valuables on the counter. String, rawhide, quick knots, wrists crossed, the floorboards rough beneath a cheek. It was the old code he had drilled. Speed, clarity, restraint. The difference between a story told over breakfast and a county's worth of blood fever could be 3 seconds and a steady voice. Across the lane, the hotel's noise thinned to wire as the men moved in. A piano key stumbled, a chair scraped. Orders, first in Spanish, then in English, cut through the room like a plumb line. No need to shout when the steel in your tone can do the heavy work. People obeyed the logic of it. They always did until they didn't. It happened the way such things happen, in a crack of error so small you could mistake it for nothing at all. A teamster, some would say a mule driver, some would swear he was deaf and never heard the warning, rose out of his chair without the grace of permission. Fear has poor ears. A shout turned to a muzzle flash. Then the dry concussion of a second shot. Then two more. The music of the night was replaced by a polyrhythm of panic. Boots scrambling, a woman's cry, a bottle shattering in a back room. Leander Davidson, the hotel man, tried to cross his own threshold as if a doorway could shelter a man from his times. He went down where he stood, and two others with him, their names carried into papers and coroner's ink by men who slept badly for weeks afterward. There is a silence after gunfire that has its own shape. Vasquez felt it settle and knew the edge of his code had done little good. Once the first shot rang, the law would hear only the end of the song, not the careful verses that came before. He finished the job, methodical as a bookkeeper under pressure, while his men gathered what could be gathered: purses, a few watches, the modest cash box contents, rings that came off fingers with shameful ease. One witness would later insist he saw the bandit take only a couple of dollars from a boy. Two coin-bright insults that would grow heavier in the telling. In the greater tally, the haul was nothing to brag about. In the balance of reputation, it was everything. They left the town bound and breathing, their orders ringing in the ears of men who would swear to them later, stay down, stay quiet, live. They were gone before the dust settled, hoofbeats painted over by wind in the grass and the first incredulous oaths. The telegraph did its part, clicking the news outward like a thrown stone on water. Tres Pinos, robbery, murder. The letters ran up the valleys and down the coast, through depot rooms that smelled of hot iron and pipe smoke, into the ears of men who had sworn that California would not play host to banditry without a proper answer. The answer came in proclamations and purses. Rewards climbed. The governor's pen made the numbers bold enough for the timid to consider becoming brave. Sheriffs assembled men who knew the country in their bones, and men who didn't but pretended well. A posse is always a mixture of both. And then there was Harry Morse of Alameda County, keen-eyed, relentless, who kept mileage like a penitent keeps vows. He followed rumors the way a good tracker reads light on grass, where it bends, where it springs back, where it keeps a print. He counted creek crossings and gamblers' boasts. He interrogated a sore-footed horse with more patience than he spared for talkers with soft hands. Vasquez answered, as he always had, with motion. They turned south and west, stitching the coast range to the San Joaquin with a zigzag tailor's proof of a route. They used the old ways, arroyos, cattle paths so faint they were more habit than trail. Stage grades skirted at night, so the first light found them already almost gone. People on porches and in barnyards saw things they were not sure they saw, and the law, if it arrived at all, arrived late and thirsty. In the wake of Tres Pinos, the papers began to write him as if he were two men at once, the cutthroat and the courtly thief. It is one of the frontier's odd economies that such dual pictures sell equally well. Some columns burned with righteousness, listing the dead and the widowed as if to reopen wounds. Others lingered on the outlaw's manners, the tidy knots, the careful assurances that lives would be spared if sense prevailed. The contradiction was not a mistake. It was the engine of fascination. People wanted a villain they could hate and a legend they could hum under their breath. December brought a cold that sharpened everything: the stars, the distances, the nerves. In a town called Kingston, strung along the Kings River like beads on a string, merchants took comfort in the season's slow pace. The 26th fell quiet after the Christmas comings and goings. The sky held a hard light that made men squint and women pull shawls closer. Vasquez had watched the town with the hunter's patience he prized, counted doors, noted who lingered at the blacksmiths, who kept money in a till, and who kept it on the hip. He preferred enterprises with regular habits. That day, the town had the vulnerable predictability of a man expecting nothing worse than a late payment. They rode in with masks and without doubt. A man in the lead, calm, his words clipped, the set of his revolver enough to write the rules, announced what needed announcing. Shops were entered and emptied. The telegraph office, the general store, the saloon, each learned the grammar of helplessness and education in minutes. Watches, rings, cash. The tally rose fast enough to seem like abundance. Later accounts would put it near $2,500, give or take a lie. There is a way an outlaw can hold a room that has little to do with the weight of his pistol and much to do with how he uses silence. Vasquez employed that silence like a craftsman uses a favorite tool. No shots this time. No sudden tears in the fabric, only the rude scissors of command cutting through an afternoon. When they were done, they took fresh horses, tipped hats they did not deserve to wear, and rode away into the low sun. The wire hummed again, this time with a sharper note. A state can forgive insult for about a day. Then it became a question of pride. Governor, sheriff, editors, the triad that makes policy at speed, tightened the language. Scourge, marauder, outlaw chief. Rewards grew teeth. Shopkeepers who had once spoken of Vasquez with a mixture of fear and neighborly curiosity now slapped the counter and demanded results. Meanwhile, mothers told their children to come inside before dusk, and men who fancied themselves brave put their pistols closer to hand when the dog barked. That December, California's winter sky filled with opinions, and one man's name made the mercury jump in every room. Harry Morse rode on, tireless and methodical, his mind a moving ledger of possible hideouts. He knew what many posse members did not, that a man like Vasquez did not live in the open wild so much as in the margins, adobes and lean-tos, the empty farmhouse between tenants, the back room of a store where a cousin's cousin looked the other way. The outlaw's geography is social, not scenic. It is measured in favors and debts, not miles. In those margins, women boiled soup for wounded men. A spare blanket appeared. A message was sent by a boy who did not know the trouble carried in his innocent stride. And alongside those kindnesses, the trap was already being set, woven by jealousies and the quiet mathematics of survival. Who could be bought? Who might reconsider loyalty if the price of silence grew too high? Who wanted a rival humiliated or a relative protected? By the turn of the new year, the chase had become something larger than law. It was a referendum on the state's own story. The old Californio families watched the papers and measured the contempt in the columns, the way an insult can be rolled around like a bitter seed. Anglos measured their progress in law and order against the stubborn fact of one man's continued freedom. Each mile Morse rode was a paragraph in that argument. Each successful job by Vasquez, however bloodless, however polished, was an erasure of the line the state meant to draw between yesterday's chaos and tomorrow's order. What Tres Pinos began, Kingston confirmed. Tiburcio's name could not be kept local. It was on the lips of gamblers, homesteaders, cattlemen, and priests. It rang down the rows of grapevines where laborers squinted toward the horizon. It rode in purses, in telegraph clicks, in the careful avoidance of speaking too loudly at the wrong table. Out in the counties, fallen leaves skittered over porch planks while men stared at the road, imagining a dust plume that could be only wind, or could be the law, or could be fate. And there, in the spaces between town and town, country and canyon, between what the papers demanded and what his own code allowed, rode Tiburcio Vásquez, his fame now too large to dismount, his choices narrowing like a canyon at flood stage. Southward lay sandstone cut like ship ribs, clear water pooled in rock bowls, and an adobe where the future waited, patient and armed. He did not know the shape of that future yet, but he could feel the air changing, the way a man senses a storm an hour before the first drop. The fuse lit at Tres Pinos had burned past Kingston, and there was nothing left for anyone to do but follow its hiss toward the rocks. The country south of the San Joaquin is a book of stone written in wind and light. Follow the old stage grade through Antelope Valley, and the land begins to lift and tilt, shale to sandstone, until the earth itself seems to lean into the sky. There are places here where a man can see a posse coming a mile off, and others where he can step sideways and vanish as if the hill had closed its mouth. In 1874, when the winter's bite let go and the chaparral shook out its dust, Tiburcio Vásquez took the southern trails and made the rocks his confessional and his court. He moved first among familiar names whispered by drovers and muleteers: Elizabeth Lake, Little Rock Creek, Soledad Canyon, water and cover, and a web of paths so old even the deer use them without thinking. North of Los Angeles, the country narrows to a crease, and there the strata rise like ship ribs, what men now call Vasquez Rocks, though in that spring they were just a blessed tangle of overhangs and crevices where a rider could sleep dry and wake unseen. The tallest fin stands a good 150 feet. From its crown, a man can count dust plumes like beads on a rosary, tallying who crosses the flats and who does not. For weeks at a time, he made those ledges a headquarters that wasn't a house. Shallow caves for the men, a little basin of water cupped in stone, a lookout where the air tasted of safety and danger in equal measure. The sandstone is still warm on late afternoons, and if you stand in the right shadow, you can imagine boot soles polished by it, the hush of men holding their breath as riders pass below. Yet a man cannot live forever on lookout points. Work must be done, and in that spring the work followed the Silver Road east toward the Inyo Mountains. The Cerro Gordo mines fed ingots and coin to the world by way of the Owens Valley stages, and every 10 or 12 miles a station offered water and a place to swap horses under the hard blue sky. In a narrow run called Coyote Holes, with rock walls close enough to muffle a shout, Vasquez and his riders stepped out of the glare as if they had peeled themselves from the stone. The driver checked his team to a stumbling halt. The messenger put a hand to his weapon. Orders sliced the air. Some say the passengers gave up their coin and their quiet quickly. Some say one man, stubborn or simply slow to believe, refused the script and paid in blood. When it was over, the stage stood lighter by silver and heavier by fear, and the outlaw band was already climbing the ribs of the land toward a different wind. South again, to the chaparral and the slow, tawny roll of hills between the San Gabriel and the city that was not yet a city. Here the outlaw's geography grew more social than scenic. An empty storeroom behind a grocer's, where a cousin's cousin kept a pallet ready. A ranch hand's cook fire where a bowl of caldo could be traded for a promise to keep a mouth shut. An orchard shed whose door looked like any other door until you noticed the hinge polished more than the neighbor's. Vasquez rode these margins like a man crossing a river on stones only he could see. To outsiders it looked like luck. To those who fed him, hid him, or turned their backs as he passed, it looked like loyalty repaid for slights too old for the new courts to recognize. Even so, every favor scratches the ledger. Every night under someone else's roof writes an IOU in a script no lawyer will ever read. In April, the ledger came due at a ranch that rose along the crest of low hills southeast of the Pueblo. Alexander, or Alessandro, Repetto's place, a sheepman from Genoa who counted wealth by flocks and by the sturdiness of his fences. The band rode in smartly, some say disguised in borrowed coats. The household learned the same grammar of helplessness that Kingston had learned in December. There were orders in accented English and sharper Spanish. There was the smell of fear and sweat and lamp smoke. There was the quick slap of a hand when a boy moved too fast. What came next depends on which account you trust. The newspapers would have readers believe that Vasquez beat Repetto and pried loose a hoard in coin and bars. Tens of thousands, said some, a fabulous sum meant to satisfy a public appetite for moral arithmetic. Others, cooler memories, closer to the ground, reckoned less, cash on hand and what could be shaken from a ranch in a hurry, enough to sting and to feed a dozen men for a month, not enough to buy themselves a kingdom. Even the date shifts by a day depending on who's telling it. Mid-April, surely. But whether the law's first nibble came on the 15th or the 18th, one thing holds. The raid at Repetto's ranch rang like a bell in town, loud enough to draw attention from men not easily distracted. After Repetto, the air itself seemed thinner, as if the chaparral had less shadow to spare. Pursuit pressed in from Los Angeles, not just the usual roundup of stout-hearted farmers and men eager to prove themselves, but watchful riders who knew the little byways into the San Gabriels and the way a hoofprint looks when a man is trying not to leave one. Twice, perhaps 3 times, the net sagged within a canyon or two of the outlaw camp, and twice, perhaps 3 times, Tiburcio walked the stones across, his men whispering and passing rifles hand to hand as if the iron could talk them quiet. He left campfires that were more ash than coal and a ground print that read like a riddle, a coffee spill, a horsehair caught in scrub, a boot heel pressed too deep for prudence. It was close, and he knew it. Close has a taste, metallic, like a coin held on the tongue, and his men could taste it too. The debates that had trailed him for years came to a boil. In kitchens where the old language still set the table, people asked one another if it was justice to bind a rancher and take his money when the courts had been binding old families and taking their land for 20 years. In newspaper offices warm with ink and self-regard, editors framed the same question with different punctuation. What right had a thief to claim honor when widows had wept at Tres Pinos? Scholars later would call such men social bandits, half rebel, half criminal, standing in the door between grievance and greed. No one used that term then, but the thought itself was as common as dust. It lived in a shrug at a doorway when riders asked for water, in a woman's quick glance away from the road when hoofbeats passed, in the way a man with a badge found a porch empty of witnesses at noon. The frontier ran on such balances, fear and admiration, contempt and kinship. And Vasquez lived where the beam was never still. He did not abandon the old courtesies even with the walls closing in. At the rocks north of Soledad, he kept the same rules. No wasted bullets, no quick tempers, a clean knot, and a cleaner exit. He measured his men not just by who could ride and shoot, but by who could be silent in a cave for a day while a posse drank at the spring below. Silence can be a terror if you let it. He taught them to make it a shelter instead. From the high fin, he watched the road through Mint Canyon and the wagon track toward Newhall, and though he could not have named it, he was counting the future. How often the law dared this far, how many horses they brought, whether their discipline held when the sun cooked brains and the sage turned the wind to needles. He counted, too, the small luxuries in the camp, the last slab of bacon, the bit of coffee left in the sack, as a banker counts coin, knowing that each decision would be paid for in miles. If legend were enough, he might have ridden that ridge forever. But legends have arteries, and his ran through kitchens and stables and the thin walls of adobes where sleep is light and secrets are lighter. In Los Angeles, there lived a man called Greek George, Georgios Karalambo, who once drove camels for the United States Army's ill-fated experiment in desert transport. He kept an adobe in the low, rolling ground of Rancho La Brea, with scrub 5 to 7 feet high, bracketing the house on 3 sides and a view south across open plain. To an outlaw accustomed to sight lines and quick exits, it looked like a refuge built by Providence. To a sheriff accustomed to informants and the slow leak of jealousy, it looked like a net someone else had already strung. Vasquez drifted there between forays, a guest whose presence could heat a household like a hidden coal. He played guitar for the ladies, some say. He settled his hat at an angle that meant charm rather than threat. He made the mistake every hunted man makes if he lasts long enough. He believed he could be both a shadow and a gentleman at once. The spring lengthened. The posses learned the taste of dust in Soledad and the echo a hoof makes under the sandstone vaults. In town, men talked less and watched more. Out at Repetto's, work resumed under a sky that pretended nothing had happened. In the rocks, a man with a careful smile counted days and favors and wondered, perhaps, which would run out first. The wind moved as it always does, combing the sage, closing one trail with fallen twigs and opening another with a storm no one saw coming. Near Rancho La Brea, in an adobe ringed with brush and riddled with rumor, a different wind was rising, the kind that gathers in silence and arrives all at once with the creak of a wagon's springs and the whisper a lawman makes when he chooses the moment to speak. The rocks can keep a man's secrets. Houses are less faithful. What the sandstone guarded through a dozen narrow escapes, an adobe would betray with a single door swung wide at dawn. The riders who had shadowed him from the mines to the chaparral were drawing their circle small. Somewhere outside the city, a sheriff set down a pen and reached for something that had the quiet authority of certainty. In the canyons, coyotes sang at night for reasons that made sense only to them. In a little house on rolling ground, a man too famous to breathe like other men tried to sleep. The trail he had chosen was almost out of road. Sheriff William "Billy" Rowland understood something about shadows. If you ride hard at one, you wear yourself out while it stays cool and patient on the ground. He had tried the obvious way, men, horses, dust, and watched Tiburcio Vásquez pour through the fingers of pursuit like water. So he put down his hat, kept his badge behind a desk for once, and planned a trap that required less thunder and more quiet. The quiet began with an ordinary wagon, canvas over hoops, the sort of thing that made deliveries along the lanes near Rancho La Brea, where barley shivered in the breeze and the chaparral muttered to itself. Inside, under the sacks and crates, Roland's chosen men waited, breath shallow, hands steady by decision rather than nature. There is a discipline to stillness few men master. A posse that can be patient is more dangerous than one that can shoot straight. The driver flicked the reins and the wagon rolled, innocent as a prayer, toward the adobe of a man everyone called Greek George, a camel handler turned smallholder whose home had lately become a crossroads of rumor. Within that adobe, the contradictions of a hunted life were on display. Vasquez had drifted through more than once, with a gentleman's smile and a musician's grace. He had the good manners that made strangers trust him, the careful hat, the soft-voiced greeting, the way his eyes took measure without insult. He carried danger like other men carry a scent, faint, then unmistakable. The household was split along invisible lines, fear and admiration on one side, calculation on the other. Somewhere between the kitchen and the yard, a whispered confidence had stepped over the threshold and gone riding. Dawn is a courteous time for ambush. Shadows are long, tempers are short. The wagon rattled up in the half-light. Hens hopped, affronted. A dog sneezed awake. The driver asked a question about a delivery that did not exist. In the house, someone shifted a bolt. A woman called to someone else. A man coughed the cough of a sleeper who wants the day to pretend it has not begun. Roland was not there. That was the genius of it. He would not be the face in the doorway that made the outlaw bolt. He would be the absence that made the timing clean. The canvas stirred, then surged. Men spilled from the wagon like a sudden flock of blackbirds. Boots hit the hard yard with a thud that made the adobe answer. A voice spoke a single word, "Now!" And the circle was closed before any horse could be thrown a saddle or any door thrown wide enough. Vasquez, already awake in that light sleeper's way, reached for the window that faced the open country, and the glass gave up its life in a single hard shatter. A shotgun roared. Plaster puffed from the wall like a white breath. A second report bit the window frame. He fell back, swore, pushed to his feet out of habit and fury combined. And then the room filled with men, faces set not with triumph, but with the grim attention of craftsmen finishing a delicate job. They bound him as he had bound others, wrists crossed, the knot efficient and unkind. Blood ran from his wounds, ugly but not mortal. His hat lay upside down in dust he had tracked in himself. His boots had scuffed a pattern by the window that a careful mind might have read like music. He said something then, wry, flavored with pain and pride, and one of the deputies let the corner of his mouth move before he remembered who he was. Out through the doorway came the outlaw California had argued about for years, the morning sun making a hard coin of his profile. He looked suddenly smaller outdoors, as if the walls had held him up, but the spine remained. Even hurt, he moved like a man who refused to belong to anyone else's history. Word outran the wagon back to Los Angeles. By the time they reached the jail, faces were already turned toward the door. Crowds are a strange weather, arriving from nothing, boiling into heat, then cooling again. They craned for a look at a man who had been headline and ghost, curse and corrido. Women noticed the careful cut of his hair, the neatness he'd insisted on even when sleep was a borrowed thing. Men checked their own names against the list of those who had failed to catch him and found both relief and envy. The jailer's ring of keys made a sound that might as well have been a chorus, history snapping shut. He did not shrink from attention. He had never shrunk from it. Within a day, he was granting interviews from behind bars, speaking in even tones, letting the ink slingers take down every denial and every flourish. He said he had never killed. He regretted that men had died in the prosecution of an unlawful calling, a phrase so precise and odd that it stuck to the page like burrs to a writer's trouser leg. He knew the power of a good sentence and the peril of a bad one. He parceled his words, spending them like coin. Reporters went away with notebooks full of contradiction, and the public read those contradictions with the hunger people reserve for those who seem larger than their crimes. Photographers arrived with tripods in the grave ceremony of their trade. The plates were heavy. The light had to be right. The subject had to hold still as if willing time to pause. He obliged them, arranging himself with a courtliness that lived someplace between pride and defiance. The pictures sold in stacks, carte de visite that could be held and shown, set on mantelpieces and tucked into books. The outlaw's face flattened into a keepsake. He signed some. He let others be sold to feed his legal defense. Thus did he turn the currency of celebrity into the currency of survival. Not for the first time, he proved that a story well told can pay real bills. Jail has its rituals, and he learned them as quickly as he had learned the grammar of holdups. He listened for the guard with a gentler step. He thanked the washerwoman with a formality that made her smile despite herself. He measured out his hours not only with letters and consultations, but with the invisible weights of posture and performance. When curiosity seekers filed past the windows, he stood when he could stand, so that the witness would go away with a tale worth telling. How the bandit held himself upright, how his eyes were dark and steady, how he spoke to a child who peered around a mother's skirts and said, "Buenas tardes," as if the afternoon itself were his to bestow. The men he had ridden with were not so well placed. Some disappeared into the high country and did not come down again except in stories. Some were rounded up in the weeks that followed by deputies who had the smell of blood still in their noses from the capture. Rumors spun like locusts in summer. Betrayal here, a jealous lover there, money changing hands in amounts both laughable and tragic. The truth, as usual, kept its counsel. It was enough for the city that the man himself had been taken. Los Angeles wore satisfaction awkwardly in those days. It was a young town, and its pride bruised easily. With Vasquez behind bars, bruises faded. Visitors left offerings of a sort, a bit of news from the flats, a small prayer folded in a hand, a scrawl of admiration from a woman who should have known better, and perhaps did. He accepted what was acceptable, declined what was not. Vanity can be a trap. He knew that prison was a place where a man's reflection could talk him into foolishness. So he played his part with discipline, minding both audience and exit. There are few exits in jail, but men like him always keep a key in the mind. Words that can be used later, faces that might be useful, a rumor that could be planted in the right ear at the right hour. Outside, the law wrote its own performance. Passes were congratulated in taverns where the glassware quivered from heavy palms on wooden bars. Roland, praised for not needing to be seen, accepted handshakes with the modesty of a man who had finally persuaded a puzzle to solve itself. In the press, arguments raged again. Thief or champion, murderer or gallant robber, scourge or symptom. What mattered more than adjectives was the next act. California, which had stretched from riot to rumor to reward poster, would now shrink itself back into procedures, indictments, judges' chambers. The story would move north, to a courtroom where the light was not half so beautiful as the light off sandstone, and the language not half so interesting as a man's last ride under a big sky. In the meantime, the city queued to look at him. It is not a flattering thing to say about any place, but it is always true. People love to look. They looked at the man who had forced them to choose a side in their own minds. The man who had ridden between their categories with a kind of elegant rudeness. Some went home convinced they had seen a devil wearing a gentleman's coat. Some, a hero in chains. Most, a human being with blood on his shirt and music in his hands who had made himself into a storm and now found himself bottled in a jar with a label. Night in jail is not like night in the open. The stars cannot find you. The wind forgets your name. Vasquez lay on his cot and listened to the murmur of the city that had caught him, the way it sighed and shifted, the way it convinced itself it had not needed luck to win. He counted his breaths the way he once counted hoofbeats over hardpan, and somewhere toward morning he fell into a sleep without dreams. When he woke, the world had moved one square forward on a board he could no longer tilt in his favor. Men were writing timetables and arranging carriages. North waited, jurors and gallows, ink and oak. The rocks that had kept his secrets were far behind. Ahead was a room where secrets are forced to dress themselves as facts. He asked for a comb and used it. He asked for a clean shirt and put it on. He asked quietly for the courtesy of a moment in the sun before the journey. The guard obliged. In the small yard, the light laid a hand on his face, and he closed his eyes against it, like a man greeting an old friend. When he opened them, he nodded as if to say he understood the program now. Then he stepped back into the hallway, where men go to become defendants and legends go to become evidence. Northward, the road uncoiled under iron and oak, carrying the famous prisoner to a place where stories put on their courthouse clothes. San Jose waited with ledgers open and pens full, its rooms smelling of pine floors and printer's ink, its windows already crowded with faces that had only seen him in newsprint or in the small portraits sold from a jail window down south. He arrived not as a rider but as cargo, chains instead of reins, guards instead of companions, and the city took him in with the brisk efficiency of institutions that mean to prove themselves. January settled over the valley like a sober hand. In the courtroom, the old quarrels were recast as testimony. Who fired when, who fell where, how darkness bends a man's memory. Witnesses spoke stiffly at first, then with the momentum that comes when a room leans forward to hear you. The Pinos night, already half legend, was taken apart like a clock and laid piece by piece on a green baize table. Jurors kept their eyes on the cogs and springs and tried not to hear the tick. Vasquez sat composed, the mask he had practiced for years fitting now as if made for this one room. Courteous, attentive, an actor whose script is to appear without script at all. He denied killing any man. He admitted robbery as a calling, an unlawful calling, he would call it later, with the odd gravity of a man who prefers precise words, even as the rope is being coiled. The state had a simpler story. It pointed to bodies in a summer doorway, to the grammar of force that makes leaders answer for their men, to a community's need for a line drawn and held. The defense spoke of restraint and codes, of lives spared by steadiness when pistols could have turned panic into massacre, of a social world that had narrowed men like him into dangerous channels. But juries are not seminar tables. They returned with their one sentence, and the judge, who had begun the day in human dimensions, swelled into an instrument of the state and pronounced death by hanging. Outside, a telegraph clicked the news up and down California, and some men allowed themselves the first easy breath they'd taken in months. Time before execution dilates and shrinks by turns, he wrote. He received visitors who had made him a private compass for their sympathies and would now lose the needle. Clergymen came, because clergymen always come, and spoke of absolution and thresholds, of the other country one crosses without horse or map. He listened as a man listens to distant water, aware, grateful in the polite way of someone who does not argue with comfort. He asked that his hair be combed. He chose a shirt without stain. A sheriff measured a drop. A carpenter planed a beam. If you have ever watched a fairground go up in a field, men quiet, intent, transforming empty space into something tensely purposeful, you have seen a scaffold being made. Only the intent is sterner and the stakes are permanent. Tickets were issued. A stockade went up around the gallows to keep the spectacle from turning into a festival. Yet money changed hands for views from rooftops and upper windows, and by dawn men had found ways to stand where the law had not meant them to stand. There is a crowd's hunger that has less to do with cruelty than with a need to see the era explain itself, to be present when a story chooses an ending. The crowd that March morning was such a hunger made visible. It did not jeer. It watched. They let him out with the quiet care reserved for the dangerous and the doomed. He climbed the steps without the small hesitations some men show, placing his feet where hundreds of others had placed theirs, and making the steps seem different anyway. When the noose was settled, he looked over the heads and roofs and lines of spectators to a thin seam of hills and sky that promised a country without fences, a promise that never tells you how far away it is. Then he spoke, words balanced on that same strict wire he had used in interviews. A sentence that did not ask to be forgiven so much as to be understood. That common sense compelled him to accept the law's logic, that men had died in the course of his unlawful trade, and that the law now laid their weight upon his neck. It was both contrition and commentary, the summing up of a man who insisted he had not pulled a trigger that ended a life, and also a citizen of the frontier who could read the ledger the way the state now wrote it. A signal, a fall, a breath held by hundreds, the body's terrible obedience to physics, the rope's plain arithmetic completing what courts and carpenters had begun. A doctor's watch and the slow nod that finishes public matters. The crowd exhaled as one organism. History turned a page it had been thumb-marking for months. By noon, the scaffold was wood again, not symbol. The stockade was merely a fence that would be taken down before supper. The field remembered being a field. The press did its part. Columns filled with the choreography of the morning. Some indulged the last romance of a gallant thief who met death with poise. Others sharpened their quills on morality and warned young men away from music and midnight. In the Spanish-language circles that had watched him more carefully and more warily, grief and relief mixed like two colors that do not quite blend. There were prayers said, privately and without bravado, for a soul that had carried both charm and harm across too many miles to count. There were arguments that began again in kitchens and behind shops, arguments about old lands auctioned away, about legal English that felt like a gate with a hidden latch, about the peculiar courage it takes to live honorably when the law has changed its clothes without changing its face. What followed was quieter, but not less telling. Pauses went home. Roland, the sheriff who had known when not to appear, returned to a desk that would now be tidier for a while. Harry Morse rode on, because men like Morse do not stop riding until something inside them loosens. The state settled back into the routines it prefers, indictments, deeds, elections, and told itself that the great questions had been clarified by a rope. But questions do not end easily. They settle into stone and wait for footsteps. Up north of Los Angeles, the rocks that had hidden him keep his name still. Hikers climb the fins for a view that no longer must be used to count dust plumes and pursue survival. Children run their palms along the warm plains as if testing the earth for old heat. A park sign speaks in safe fonts about geology and television, shows that later used the formations for other myths. If anyone pauses long enough, the wind will give them the old syllabus. Watch the light, learn the water, keep an exit in your eye. The place remains a classroom for cunning, even when the only exam is whether you remembered your canteen. Vasquez became, as all such men do, two stories at once. In one, he is the scourge, the robber chief whose vanity dressed up violence in polite phrases, the gallows his deserved punctuation. In the other, he is a banner carried by a people told to stand aside, while their language and titles and customs were pushed to the edges. His thefts, a crooked protest against a straighter theft carried out in courtrooms. Between those stories is the third truth, the human scale one. A gifted, vain, magnetic man who loved attention and used it, who tried to fit a private code to a public wound and found that codes cannot keep pace with blood, who died speaking carefully into a wind that reduces all sentences to the same sigh. If you stand at sunset among the rocks that bear his name, the sandstone holds a long light before letting go. The chaparral whispers. The highway far off makes its new music. You can imagine a rider poised on the fin, counting. You can imagine a posse in the wash below, thirsty and stubborn. You can hold both pictures without forcing them to agree, and in that holding feel the frontier as it really was. Not lawless so much as contested, not romantic so much as raw, a place where justice was often a story men told to make sense of force. What remains is a question, the same one as at the beginning. What do we owe a man like Tiburcio Vásquez? Condemnation, admiration, or the harder work of seeing him entire? Legend is a quick salve. History is a slower cure. The novel we tell ourselves about the West needs both, and it needs the kind of patient gaze that looks past a noose and a headline to the long, ordinary pressures that push some lives off the legal road. Perhaps that is why the rocks keep their secrets and their names. Stone remembers what people refuse to and offers it back to us in the shape of a question at dusk.